Living through devastation and fire on a massive scale, thankfully, it's something that very few of you, particularly my subscribers, will ever really live through. You're used to fires on a small scale. Enormous scale fires are a totally different story. And thankfully, in most of the continental United States, they are a true rarity. I'm going to relate a little bit about 2017, where over 6,000 homes were burned down in a 10-hour period, and 22 people lost their lives in what was called the Tubbs Fire of 2017, and it was absolutely devastating. We're going to get into that today, and some of the lessons that might pertain and some of the things that'll be coming up to really take to note, because there's a lot of people that are angry now, that have lost their homes. There's a lot of people that are scared. They don't know what the future holds. Well, it's a devastating thing to live through, and pointing fingers is never any help. But there's some issues here you really need to be aware of. Let's get into it this morning. Back in October 8th and 9th of 2017, I remember my friends and I were returning from a overnight trip to Lake Tahoe. And as we dropped down to the Central Valley floor on our way to Sacramento and through Davis, I remember how devastating the winds were when we were driving. I'm like, oh wow, it was like a mini dust bowl, and I'm thinking, this doesn't really look good. And of course, we got hit with those winds off of the desert, and who knew overnight that night that it would be unbelievably the devastation that would be wrought on Santa Rosa. It was the first time in history that a wildfire had ever gotten loose in a major, heavily populated area. And little were we to know a year later that Paradise, California was to be even worse and wiped off the map at that particular time. Living in California presents really unique challenges, and if in the midst of that fire, I was able to get out there and record and do some of the earliest video that had been done, and some of the only video that had ever been done while the active wildfire was going on, because in pretty short order, the National Guard was called in, roads were sealed off, and the whole city was basically on lockdown for weeks and weeks. Well, we're seeing the same thing play out in LA now, but the reality of the situation is, if you insist on living in areas that are high fire risk, it does not matter what amount of vegetation that you remove from around your homes and things like that, because your neighbor may not do the same, right? It does not matter how many really fire hydrants they stick up there, water pressure and things like that, because you know what happens if you open enough fire hydrants and you're fighting fire on an epic scale. No matter what happens, your water pressure is going to be compromised because, well, there's too many hoses drawing off of that pressure source, and as a result, overall pressure goes down. There's no way to keep up. One of the stars, Hollywood stars, Sarah Michelle Gellar, was complaining that there's no water pressure in the hydrants because we don't have enough of a reservoir here, because the Native Americans wanted to protect a fish. It's simple-minded reasoning like that can be really devastating at times like this, and pointing fingers at the governor or the feds or whatever back and forth. But the reality is this, and I saw it here in Santa Rosa as I toured the devastation that was done in a lot of the, particularly the higher elevations. It's extremely hard to fight a fire on heavily sloped terrain. And when you put heavy wind activity up to 100 miles an hour on top of that, it makes firefighting impossible from the air. You dare not put up fixed wing or helicopters because they're at tremendous risk of crashing in those type of winds. everything has to be fought from the ground. And you can imagine winding and twisting through some of these canyons in Malibu and up these slopes. It's going to be a slow, and it's going to be, well, for lack of a better way, it's going to be a useless activity. It's not going to matter. Fire sweeps up, right, and it burns. It has because heat rising, it has a tendency to spread rapidly above it. 2017 really left a mark on this community, and I remember people commenting to me, Rosie, you just don't seem the same after these fires. And I was in a protected area in the very middle of Santa Rosa, but going out there and seeing the devastation was, well, maybe it did trigger a little PTSD, who knows. I've never seen devastation on such a massive scale, where 6,000 homes, whole swaths of fire had leaped an 8-lane highway and jumped to the other side and decimated other communities, Coffee Park and Mark West Springs. You didn't know which way to turn, and I remember when the Berkeley Fire Department, and the videos are still up there, when the Berkeley Fire Department responded to a call to come up and help because there was a fire in Santa Rosa. They thought they were coming up to help put out a small brush fire. And as they're coming up Highway 101, which splits Santa Rosa into east and west, you could hear the firefighters commenting in the cab, looking left and right, and they're going through town, and all they see is fire to the left of them, fire to the right, whole hills consumed, street after street. And the only thing that they could say to themselves is, where in the hell do you begin fighting something like this? Well, thankfully here in Santa Rosa, the winds died down a couple days later, and the fire was checked moving westward because it hit vineyards. And they were to find out that great vineyards make excellent fire breaks when it comes to stopping the spread of fire. Well, lesson learned too late, it didn't much matter. But I can tell you in terms of LA and other places, and here in Santa Rosa, and I'm sad to say they're back on those hills again. Here in places like Fountain Grove, rebuilt those homes, those that were able to use the insurance to rebuild. And I can tell you the same thing is going to happen again. I don't know how long it will be, but if you look at the Press Democrat, our local paper from 1964, the exact same fire, the exact same path and footprint of that fire in 1964 was reproduced in 2017. And the results were devastating. So it doesn't matter, right? People feel like as long as I can get insurance, I'm going to be okay. Well, that, of course, will be the great limiting factor. Now, coming up in LA, you can expect a couple things. Number one, the rise of looting and potential looting. LA is a huge metropolitan area with probably 6 million people around there, of which some measure of those people are lowlifes and opportunists. And they know up in those hills, there's a treasure trove of things to be dug out up there. And you better believe there's a mass migration of people moving in that direction that are lowlifes, that are going to take advantage of the situation. So no doubt you will hear calls for the National Guard to get in there and set up and block all these streets off and keep traffic from going into those areas. Despite the fact that there'll be people begging on their knees, I've got to go in and see to see if my home is still standing, or what's left of my dog. Did my dog make it, or my cat make it? And you're hearing the same stories in LA that we heard here in Santa Rosa. People just begging, and they just have to say, no, we can't let you in there. The air quality is extremely bad. The risks are amazing in there with all the exposed raw sheet metal, cars flipped over on their hoods. I mean, that's one of my memories, and I'll put the link to my playlist down below, the Great Santa Rosa Fire playlist. One of my distinct memories, I kept going through these neighborhoods, riding through and walking through, and seeing all these cars on their roofs. And I thought, how in the hell did this happen? And finally I understood that as the fire raged through there, moving the length of a football field every 5 minutes, those gas tanks were literally exploding on the cars and flipping them up in the air and dropping them back down. Very dangerous situations. And a lot of people, of course, get injured and have to, get injured digging around their home sites. Yeah, eventually they'll get in there, but they're not going to find a lot left. In many cases, they may not even recognize where in the hell their home was. The second thing they're going to understand, it's not a simple matter to just bring in the backhoes and start rebuilding. Well, the foundation should be fine on these things. Not so. They found out in these high heat situations of these intense urban fires that these foundations get compromised and they get cracked. And here in Santa Rosa, all of those homes, every single home, FEMA had to come in with roll-off dumpsters and huge open bed trucks and scrape off the first 18 inches of soil on every job site and on every home site and remove every single foundation. All of that stuff, thousands and thousands of trucks went out to the Central Valley to a huge dump to dump all that stuff. So it's a long and it's a very painful type of process. And there's, I've saw, as you see in my videos, that FEMA would come and mark sites. This will be the first. Here's where we stand now. Site cleared, foundation removed, checked off, signed off, ready for a rebuild. Of course, the other big issue is insurance and rebuilding. And well, you have to prepare yourself that you may not be able to rebuild. I heard rumors, I can't say if it's true or not. I've heard some people claim that Allstate and State Farm had canceled policies in a lot of those areas. I don't know. But you better think twice about rebuilding in a particular area like that, especially on those slopes in Malibu. Yeah, it's so attractive because it's private. It's also a death trap up there. And even though to date only 5 people have died, I can tell you from experience after 2017 that they'll be finding additional people that unfortunately were incinerated in their homes at that particular time. It's a devastating thing to see destruction on such a massive scale. I know very thoroughly about that. This is going to put a lot of pressure on the housing stock, obviously, within the flatlands of Los Angeles as people scramble to get homes. There'll also be a lot of finger pointing. It'll be a lawyer's feeding trough here of people suing this person and that person. The lawyers will have a feast day on all of this, and the insurance companies and payouts, and what are we going to do? Why can't get insurance? What's ultimately going to happen, of course, is instead of shrinking the state's insurance fund of last resort, it's going to explode it now with tremendous consequences for likely for the taxpayers of the whole state of California. Nothing happens in isolation. All these firefighters, all this equipment coming in from multi-state areas. Hell, here in Santa Rosa, we had firefighters from Fiji and Australia here. At one time in October of 2017, half of every piece of fire equipment in the whole state of California was right here, trying to defend and protect this city, which had totally lost its northern edge and its wealthy edge. I also remember Charles Schulz, the great comic of Peanuts, whose wife had to flee her home up there in the middle of the night and escape. Luckily, all of his stuff was in a museum by that particular time that people can still enjoy today. But the devastation is real. Expect the finger pointing, expect the National Guard, Expect people to be very bitter about this experience, but as the old saying goes, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. If you insist on building on terrains like this, it's impossible to defend, no matter if you have 1,000 fire hydrants up there, because you don't have 1,000 hoses that are going to be hooked up at one time on your block to defend anything, and you're going to have that wind raging and upsloping there, and there's no amount of water in the world sprayed on that that's going to make a difference. Okay, that's the reality. And if people choose to live in that, well, you can imagine they're talking about $54 billion of damage so far. I wouldn't be surprised if it hit $100 billion. And well, let me tell you, that's going to take a toll when a lot of these insurance companies that have to start paying out have to start liquidating some of their assets to make these payoffs. Well, you know what those assets are going to be that they hold. So beware. A dramatic event like this can have a tremendous knock-on effect in the entire economy. Okay? Well, that's my take, having lived through the same exact thing in 2017. Thank goodness. I always say to myself, thank goodness that I was in the hood at that particular time, safe, surrounded by the cocoon of just flatlands and everything else. Not to say it could never happen, but I remember feeling to myself, oh, I'm so lucky that I don't live. I'm so lucky I don't have the money to live up on the hill here. You can see as I rolled that video of devastation how bad it was, and it didn't matter how much money you had. It was all going down. Anyway, there's my take, and God bless all the people that have been in harm's way and been affected by that. And lives that are upended, certainly they deserve our thoughts and prayers. As for me, thanks so much for watching here. If you're not subscribed, people seem to really enjoy my commentaries here, and I really appreciate that. And I really only have that type of commentary if I've lived through it historically and have something to say about it, okay? This is something that I've seen before and something that we will certainly see again. Thumbs up are appreciated, your subscription, and thanks so much for watching, everybody.